Good morning, neighborhood kids and everyone else. I am so glad you are here today for another story from God's Word, the Bible, which we know is absolutely true and completely trustworthy. And it teaches us how to live lives that please, capital G, God. We do that because we love Him. We want to please Him. Today's story I want you to think of as like a bridge. A bridge takes us from one place to another. And that's what we're going to do today. Last week we left the Israelites. They had just crossed the Red Sea, and we're going to take a leap and go across this bridge as it was to 400 years later. And if you have been walking along with me through the Bible, hopefully you'll find it's a lot of a review. But we are going to begin all the way back in Genesis as we start on this bridge today with Abraham. And I want you to remember that God made a covenant, a legal promise to Abraham that he was going to make him a great nation and give his family the land of Canaan. And we're going to see how God does that today. He said, Abraham, your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. That is a lot of people. Well, Abraham had a son named Isaac, and God made that same covenant with him. And Isaac had two sons. You remember Jacob and Esau, and Jacob had 12 sons, and it is these 12 sons who ended up in Egypt and grew to be the nearly 2 million people that left under the leadership of Moses and Aaron when God rescued them from being slaves to Pharaoh. And the book of Exodus tells us that story of how the people cried out to God for help because it was so hard to live under Pharaoh. And God brought Moses and Aaron along to rescue them. And they have now crossed the Red Sea. They are in the land of the Sinai Peninsula. And that is where we're going to pick up part of our story today. So, real quickly on our map, they were in Egypt, and now they have crossed to the middle there, that Sinai Peninsula, if you want to think about them being on top of that bridge. And here, God provided manna, kind of like a sweet flake for them to eat. He provided quail when they cried out and said, "We want meat." He even provided them with water in the desert. So they were never without what they needed the whole time that they were there. And while they were there in the desert, they also built a tabernacle. A tabernacle was like a tent for a church, and it could go with them wherever God led them through. God gave them good rules to follow. We call them the 10 Commandments. It's about how to get along with God and how to get along with people. And God was calling them to live like devoted fans of Him. Well, now we are going to jump to another book. And that other book is called Joshua. Because as Joshua opens, we find out that Moses, at 120 years old, has died. And now Joshua is going to be the leader. Joshua was one of the few, only 2 people who lived from the time of crossing that Red Sea all the way to getting to go into the Promised Land. It's been 40 years since the Israelites left Egypt. And God said to Joshua, "You are going to be the one to lead them in." He said, "Be strong and courageous, because you, Joshua, are going to lead these people into the land that I promised in the covenant to give their forefathers." We see here God is fulfilling that covenant. He is a promise keeper, and He's going to give them the land. Well, as long as Joshua was alive and leading them, the people followed and loved and worshiped capital G God, the one true God. But when Joshua dies, what do you think will happen? Will they continue to be devoted fans of God or not? Well, the book of Judges gives us the answer. It's probably one of the most gory and violent books in the whole Bible. If you like that kind of stuff, I'd encourage you to read it. But it does have an important lesson for us, and that lesson is that we need to choose whether we're going to be devoted fans of God or not. It comes down to one choice. Because we are to follow God with our whole heart and all of our strength. In Judges 1, if you want to turn there now, we find out that probably Samuel wrote this book, and that it's going to tell us about 350 years of life for the Israelites in the promised land where they now are, which is up here. We call it Canaan. Oops, it's still red. And we find out that under Joshua, the Israelites had conquered the most important cities. They had gotten rid of the Canaanites. That maybe sounds terrible, except that the Canaanites had chosen not to follow God. And so God said, you need to get rid of them. And they did most of the work, but not all of the work. And really that meant they disobeyed God. And that was a problem, because they let their children marry the Canaanite children. They started worshiping the little g gods of the Canaanites instead of the one true God of Israel. And God was very, very sad about that. They were choosing to keep on sinning, even though they knew about the one true God. And God said, because you have disobeyed me in that, I'm going to let the Canaanites be like a thorn in your side. If you have ever cut roses off a plant and you get poked with a thorn, you know how much that hurts. Or if you've had a pebble in your shoe, even a tiny little grain of sand, you know how irritating that can be. And that's what God said the Canaanites were going to be like to the Israelites. They would be a thorn in their side. Well, when it got really hard and they couldn't stand it any longer, God sent them a judge. The judge was there to rescue the people, to help them, to turn their hearts back to the one true capital G God. And every time they did that, God forgave them, just like he will for us each time we sin. But unfortunately, it didn't stay that way. Maybe you remember this wheel, this cycle from before. The Israelites entered into this cycle, something that you do over and over again. Israel served God. They loved the one true God. But then they would sin and be punished. And then they'd cry out to God, and God would send a judge, and they'd be so happy they were saved, and they'd serve God, and then they'd fall back into sin. The sin for them was worshiping these little g gods, things that were less important. And then they would go through this time of punishment and crying out to God, and God would send the judge, and they'd be saved, and they'd serve God, and it just went around and around 12 times, 350 years of doing this and living this way. The book of Judges ends with this statement, and you can think of it as being the other side of the bridge now. In those days, Israel had no king, and they did whatever they wanted. You see, the people of Israel could not please God on their own. They really needed the ultimate king, who is Jesus, who would be born many years later. And we can stop and ask ourselves, are we like the Israelites? Do we keep sinning, and then we cry out to God, and we come back, and we serve him, and we get on that cycle? But you know what? The important thing is that we do come back, and that we ask God to forgive us, because he will never give up on us. And he will forgive us over and over again, because he loves us so much.